Welcome to another episode of Montana Shares. I'm your host, Bill Crane, and today I have Matt with Friends of the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. Welcome to the show again, Matt.
Thanks, Bill.
So last time we chatted about all the changes that were affecting you as far as COVID goes. Underlying all that is you do have a mission, you do have work that you're doing. Let's talk about forget about COVID for a while. What are you doing at the museum in the normal scheme of things?
Sure, and that's something I'm glad you brought it up, Bill, because that's something we take really seriously. Is that our mission is to educate the public about Missoula County history and Fort Missoula history, and despite the fact that we can't gather in person, we still have to find creative ways to do that, and we still have, of course, our day-to-day projects that we're working on. We have two pretty major projects that we're working on at this point, and the first one I'd like to mention is the restoration of our Willamette locomotive number 7. This is a really great piece of history. It was built in Oregon and shipped here to be used at the Bonner Mill. And it was in service for a significant period of time through the 1940s and 50s. Never traveled more than, we believe, about 80 miles from Missoula. So it would go back and forth between the logging camps and haul logs back to the mill. After its retirement, it actually had a really fun story in that it was a star of a Hollywood film. So there's a Hollywood film by the name of Timberjack, if you've ever heard of it. It's not exactly an A movie, if you know what I mean, but it was done in the 1950s, and it was kind of that Western battle type of thing. But one of the fun facts about it was that the film was all filmed here in Western Montana, and they needed a locomotive. So they unretired our Willamette locomotive and used it as part of the shooting of it. After that, the locomotive was then kind of put in a park and kind of put to rest, and it got moved here to the Historical Museum back in the 1980s. So it had been here for about 30 years, and over time, as we all know, the Western Montana winters take a toll on things. So we hatched this plan to start to restore the locomotive. And the first step in that, we did a phase 1, which was to build a pole barn to cover the locomotive just to keep those winters off of it. And we were fortunate we were able to raise the funding for that at the end of last year. And this summer, that barn got put up. So it's a great first step. And now we're in the process of raising funds to actually do the physical restoration of the locomotive. And it's coming along fairly well. I mean, obviously, COVID's thrown us all a curveball, but we're still doing our best to raise awareness of this neat piece of Montana history and to just, raise the funds we need to restore it so that it's kind of back to its original glory.
Okay. And what's your second project?
Sure. So the other project is something that's really been kind of a driver of what we do at the Historical Museum in the last 5 or 6 years, and that's in telling the stories of the 2,200 Italian nationals and Japanese resident aliens who were held at the internment camp at Fort Missoula during World War II. We've really had a number of projects over the years, everything from an interpretive trail to a documentary to new exhibit. We brought in filmmakers and documentary films and such. But the newest project is we were able to rescue, or save, I should say, 2 original alien detention center barracks that were here in our community. And kind of not to go too much into a history lesson for you, Bill, but so all these buildings, there were these essentially 20 by 45 foot barrack buildings where the men were housed during this World War II internment camp era. And after the camp closed, the buildings were essentially dispersed to a number of different folks in the community, everything from a couple of them that are up at Yellow Bay on Flathead Lake to a number that were incorporated as apartments in Missoula. But 2 of those buildings, one ended up at the DNRC office here in Missoula as a kind of a maintenance shed, and another ended up as one of the fairground buildings. Well, in the last couple of years, those 2 organizations were moving forward with a different plan. So they were looking to either tear down or get rid of those buildings. So they reached out to us, and then were kind enough to partner with us to bring those buildings back to Fort Missoula. So we have the 2 buildings on site now, but historic preservation is a long process. It takes a lot of planning, and it's not inexpensive. So we've started. We did receive a Japanese American Confinement Sites grant in 2019, or actually this summer in 2020. And that was to pay for the assessment and planning to prepare these buildings for a full restoration. And we did that. That process is just about complete, and we're now starting to look at phase 2, which will be the physical restoration of these buildings. And that's exciting, but what I'm most excited about with this project is that When it's finished, one of those buildings will be turned into climate controlled collection storage, which as a museum, we always are running out of space. I mean, we care for 45,000 objects in our collection. So there's always a problem with having the proper spaces to store these objects in. So one of the buildings will be fully restored on the outside and be climate controlled storage on the inside. And the second building is, I absolutely love this, is it will be fully restored both inside and out to look as it would have when the Italian and the Japanese men were here at Fort Missoula. So I find that real power in that sense of place and history that you experience when you step into a space like that. So now we'll have these three buildings, so two buildings that we're restoring and one that already exists here on our site as an exhibit building. So visitors will be able to step inside that space to kind of get a feel for what those men experienced, and then go right next door and see a comprehensive exhibit that tells the story of those men in the camp here at Fort Missoula. So I think it'll be a really powerful interpretive tool we have as a museum once that project is finished. So, but as you can imagine, with two projects of this magnitude, we've been pretty busy, despite the fact that we're dealing with a pandemic.
Yeah, I toured the facility, I believe it was last year or the year before, and I have to say the internment exhibit was probably one that I had no idea it existed in Montana. I knew there were Japanese camps along the coast, but I did not know we had one here. And then the Italian aspect was also very fascinating, and touring the courtroom and whatnot was very moving to me. It was a very interesting experience, probably one of the highlights of touring the museum.
Thank you. And it's such a interesting and sad story in that matter about what happened to these men during World War II. But what I found interesting, because we've gotten more involved in the Japanese American confinement sites community in recent years, and there's a lot of awareness of these War Relocation Authority camps where the 120,000 Japanese Americans went. But there were also another type of camp, these Department of Justice camps, like ours was, that were used for resident aliens and kind of foreign nationals that got caught in the US. And kind of the little known fact is that we actually have more original buildings that were used as part of a camp, an internment or an incarceration camp during World War II than any site in the United States. So Missoula has this resource to tell that story. And as awareness has built of the Japanese American camps, there still isn't a whole lot of awareness of this other side, these Department of Justice camp that held these foreign nationals and resident aliens. So it's really exciting for us to have the opportunity to share that story and tell that story.
Wow. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. So I'm glad that you're not sitting and resting on your laurels during this time and doing the core work that you're there to do. Thanks for being on the show and giving us that insight into the sort of the day-to-day normal work in a time of COVID.
Well, thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. And thanks for all the good work you guys do at Montana Shares.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.